Anoosh, you've written this week about the changing nature of knife crime. What have you found out?
Well, I found it really interesting because after the news of the Huntingdon attack, I had a look at the stats. And what really stood out for me is that knife crime is changing where it hits in the country. So it's actually rising a lot faster in sort of suburbia, in English provinces, than it is in the urban centres. You know, we usually associate knife crime with the inner city. And actually, in England, the highest rise on last year was in Cambridgeshire, which is where Peterborough is, which is where the suspect of this attack is from. And the train was going through there as well. And within London, the biggest rises were in outer London areas, which you might not associate with knife crime as well, places like Richmond and Kingston. And Hillingdon, which is also very relevant because less than a week before the Huntingdon attack, you had this triple stabbing in Uxbridge, which is sort of, you know, the gateway to Metroland part of London. It's suburbia. It's not a place that you associate with sort of gang warfare or knife crime in that cliched way. And so there is a changing geography to knife crime in the UK, which I think means two things. First of all, it means that the changing sort of economics of knife crime. So, you know, you have gang warfare rising up around mainly drugs. So county lines taking drugs and the associated violence with it into areas that otherwise haven't experienced it, and, you know, stretching police forces that just don't have the defences or the monitoring for it. And then also you have this, it adds to this perception that it could happen to me. It could happen anywhere. Why here? Where next? Which I don't think is necessarily the case when it's just related to gang crime in London, for example, where you could live in London all your life, as I have, and feel that it's not something that actually affects you directly. So I think it's really affecting the national mood in that way.
Yeah, I really want us to talk about, over the course of this episode, that word you used, perception, because I think it sounds counterintuitive, but actually feeling and atmosphere and mood, I do think they relate to this story. Just on the specifics though, whilst we're here, Rachel, you went to Wellingborough for a by-election last year.
Yeah, so this was in February 2024, so before the general election. This was up in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire, and it was a relevant by-election just at the time because it was a very safe Tory seat that Labour then went on to win. But one of the issues that came up that I was quite surprised to come up in that kind of area was about knife crime and was about all the things that Anoosh just said. Strained police forces that were not used to dealing with this as an issue, suddenly having something that people very much associate with inner cities out in suburbia, out in places where a lot of the other symptoms of what we've been calling broken Britain are very apparent. So things like high streets where half the shops are boarded up and the ones that remain are often betting shops or not particularly pleasant cafes and things like that. Things like having a market square that hadn't had markets in it for years. Things like issues with streetlights, issues with a sense of is there any presence of the state in a positive way in these sorts of places, the kind of parts of the public realm where the breakdown in funding and resources, particularly at a local authority level, has started to really show through quite viscerally and bring all these problems that people don't associate with those places. And I was looking at a map and thinking about some of the places that, Anoosh, you mentioned. So Wellingborough is just one county over from Cambridgeshire, but I don't think it's something to do with that part of the country in particular. It's to do with those places where you've got a lot of commuters, where you've got a lot of economic unrest, and where the focus, both in local and central government, has been elsewhere for
and I remember having a similar experience when I went to go and report in Kingswood ahead of the general election. There was a by-election there. This is like Bristolian suburbia, quite green, but again with some of the signs of the kind of degrading public realm that you just outlined there, Rachel. And there had been a problem with knife crime in Bristol at the time when I was visiting, and people were complaining about it spilling out to the suburbs, but it was manifesting in different ways. So I heard about people shoplifting, and instead of just taking stuff, you know, pulling out a knife when they were challenged by the shop staff, for example. And that's another very visible sign of crime in your area, in your everyday life. doesn't necessarily mean that kind of crime is rising, but it's just far more visible to you than if, say, it was just confined to inner city Bristol, for example.
Yeah, look, I'm so glad you brought that up because I really want to talk about it. It's this idea, perception that, outside of, bad luck, that essentially if you are a law-abiding citizen in this country, you don't seek out law breaking, that by and large, if all things are equal, the state is functioning properly, you should be able to live your life and not be that affected by crime, right? And typically, the rationalization that a Londoner living in, I don't know, a borough of East or South East London, where there is a pretty significant, gang culture, organized crime groups, will say, well, actually, do you know what? I'm not a drug dealer, and therefore it's highly unlikely that I am going to be stabbed, because right now that violence is broadly contained to that group, to use it as an example. But increasingly, the sort of the changing nature of crime. So shoplifting is a good example, because even though it feels quite minor, otherwise it impacts negatively the life of law-abiding citizens, because otherwise, when you buy your block of cheddar, and that's where we are now, you have to have a security tag taken off it. Phone snatching is another really good example, because it's indiscriminate and because it's random. If you walk out of a train station on your phone, which 99% of people in this country have done, you might have your phone stolen. It's the way that, and I will connect it to this knife crime in a second, because of the seemingly increasingly random nature of some of the atrocities that we're witnessing taking place. It's this sense that actually, not only is the state sort of losing control and that law and order isn't really that present or that strong in this country, but actually for the first time, a lot of people that otherwise would view themselves as law abiders are going, well, this is having a really material impact on my day-to-day life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the phone theft, snatch theft, I think they call it now, is a really interesting example, because yes, it's on the rise. Yes, we all know someone who's experienced it or has experienced it themselves. But it's also a result of the changing nature of technology. So the reason they snatch it from your hand is because it's unlocked when it's in your hand. They can't do much with a locked phone now that security is so tight on our devices. So there are other things that are driving certain aspects of the crimes that we're seeing more and more often now. It doesn't necessarily mean that society is breaking down. Yeah.
There was this really I can't remember the exact percentage. I think it might be something like 30%. I saw a stat that's like London is essentially the stolen phone capital of Western Europe. It's an extraordinary percentage of all of the phones stolen in Western Europe are from London.
It's also organised, and that's something else that I think has changed. It used to be kind of opportunistic, and now the people who are snatching your phone, particularly if they're on a moped or whatever, they're part of organised gangs. They know what they're doing. There's a story last week about how they're burying them for a couple of days so that the Find My iPhone tags don't work. Like, this is a project. This is a conveyor belt. This is a organised scheme, and that also, I think, adds to the crime is rising perception, because something that we used to think of as quite random and that the police will say nothing we can do about it, it's just bad luck. It's not bad luck. It's organised and it's planned.
It's the same with shoplifting as well. So we now have a problem with convenience stores buying stolen meat, for example. So it's like these gangs that are behind the shoplifting, and not just, at the height of inflation, I think one of the main items that was stolen was baby formula, and that's desperate mums trying to get their babies fed. Now, like you say, there's security tags on sort of high value protein items in supermarkets, alcohol, and that's because there's gangs, quite organised structures behind this shoplifting problem. So it's interesting how things that are seen as low level, I think that's how police describe it, don't usually, go when the shop will call them to come and help them, is actually an organised operation.
So, Rachel, let's talk about a sentence you just said, right? The perceived nature of the rising crime. Because if we bring it back to knife crime, or, the various ways to describe serious youth violence is another, but, violence with a sharp instrument, shall we say, what does the data tell us about these crimes? Are they actually increasing?
Though they're actually decreasing, and that's really important to say as part of this debate. So knife crime as a whole is coming down. Police recorded 51,527 offences in England and Wales in the year to June 2025, which is a 5% fall in the same period last year and 7% compared with 5 years ago. Homicides involving a knife are also down, and I just looked this up just ahead of this podcast, and I found the timing of this really got to me. I found a press release from the Home Office published 30th of October, so 2 days before the Huntingdon attack, saying record numbers of knives have been taken off the streets as knife murders plummet, and pointing out that knife homicides have fallen by almost 20%, while knife crime overall has fallen by the first time in 4 years. And the latest admissions data for NHS hospitals in England and Wales shows a 10% fall in admissions for knife assaults. So that's like the very, very, very latest data. Obviously, something as shocking and horrific and visceral as the Huntingdon train attack is going to impact people emotionally in how they feel going about their day-to-day lives, much more than a dry Home Office press release, which I imagine the vast majority of people won't have read. So the way that we receive news, interact with news, process news, and perceive it versus the data of what's going on are very different.
Yeah, I think it's hard to put sort of empirical analysis on this and to get out of anecdote, but speaking from personal experience, the amount of Russian soldiers that I've now watched be killed on my social media feed, and Ukrainians for that matter, the Charlie Kirk assassination, which on the day that it happened, it came to a point where I stopped opening Twitter, right? Because you could not move. It was just the video over and over and over again. And I do think the information system, the content diet that exists today, whereas in the past, Israel Gaza is actually probably a pretty good example, right? So in the past, an atrocity is committed or a war unfolds. The news cameras film it, and it goes to a newsroom, and a news editor, a program editor watches all of the footage and makes a decision about what the 10-second part that gets shown on the news is, and you can guarantee that it won't include gratuitous violence. It probably won't show a dead body. It might show someone injured, but that's probably as far as it will go. And even this person's injured, probably a limited amount of blood on them, right? Because there are decisions that get made about what does and doesn't get shown. And in a previous life, I would have said, well, those people are information gatekeepers. Why shouldn't the public be able to see this stuff? But I'm increasingly coming to a more conservative view about these things as I watch murder after murder after murder unfold on my social media, which is that, the world in which we live now, you can see the most extreme violence and watch it on repeat. And I think it's a really important part of this conversation that even if the data shows that these types of crimes are decreasing, and there's probably a separate question here about like mass atrocities and mass attacks and whether or not those are increasing or decreasing. But nonetheless, the fact that just in general, the amount of people that are stabbed and seriously harmed is on the way down. It doesn't feel like that to me. And is that just because I watch it every day?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a perception part of this. I was writing a piece about some stats I got back about the number of racially and religiously motivated crimes on public transport, which has gone up. But in order to research the piece, I was using Google, I was searching stuff on social media, and therefore the algorithm was feeding me more and more videos of people having these horrible racist confrontations on public transport. And I came away one evening from my laptop thinking, oh my God, Britain is just like this horrible conflict, tension-ridden hole. Next time I go on the tube, I was just like looking out for any sort of slight that I could possibly detect. And it wasn't the case. People were being either ignoring each other or being perfectly pleasant to each other. So I think you're right that ecosystem definitely creates this slightly paranoid mood. But there is an issue here with the changing nature of knife crime. Not only is it bubbling up, as I said, in areas that we're not used to it being in, so people who otherwise might not have been that concerned about it are concerned about it, but also you're slightly more likely now to be attacked by a stranger than you were. It's ticking up, basically, even though the overall figure on knife attacks, homicide involving a knife, hospitalizations from a knife attack are down on last year. So I think there's that randomness, the fact that someone might turn around to you when you're sitting next to them on a train and do something like that to you, which is the really frightening thing for human nature-wise,
I think the randomness point is key to it, because there is no sense of being able to protect yourself. And I think we're also getting a lot of social cues from society, often in the way that governments respond to crimes like this, that are suggesting you're right to be afraid or you should be vigilant. So the fact that bag searches are now commonplace at basically any kind of sporting or entertainment event, which definitely wasn't the case 15 years ago. The fact that metal detectors in big events venues are now pretty commonplace, sort of airport-style security, places that you wouldn't normally have it. I think it's really interesting that we're having a conversation in the wake of the Huntingdon train attack about, well, should there be further security at trains? Should there be knife arches or things like that? And I think that people don't necessarily realise that those kinds of measures in and of themselves also send the message, you need to be vigilant. This is a dangerous space. This is not a space that you can feel safe in, which is then also going to spike fear perception and mean that when you do see those news stories, which were a lot more common on social media now than they would have been, say, reading a local newspaper, you are sort of primed to go, yes, I knew that was a risk because I had all this societal messaging. I'm right to feel afraid.
Yeah. And I wonder about the sort of the political implication then of that, the sort of the powerful nature of that feeling. Because actually, I think, there's almost a risk that when you say, well, actually, whoa, everyone take a breath. Serious violence perpetrated with a knife is on the way down. And there's a world in which you say that to someone who's perhaps now increasingly paranoid, increasingly anxious, increasingly scared for their own well-being, where there's almost this reflexive, you don't get it, you don't understand, I am scared, and if you can't meet me where I am, I have no interest in sort of connecting with you politically, right? I think it's a potentially very potent emotion that more cynical and perhaps less moral political actors might seek to make political capital out of.
Yeah, it's a bit like when politicians talk about growth going up or productivity going up or GDP. That doesn't relate to people's day-to-day lives in the same way. They're still, struggling to do the weekly shop and their wages haven't gone up in X number of years. So I think you're right. I think
that's your GDP, not mine.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there's definitely a mismatch between the macro picture and what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. But then I do think it is important to mention these figures. I've had people messaging me over the weekend who aren't in journalism or politics and asking me, what's happened to our country? What's going on? And I felt compelled to say, well, the knife attacks are going down. And they were grateful to know that information. So I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about that. I don't think it's necessarily dismissing people feeling fearful. I think it is important to have that context. And also, of course, there is the risk of certain politicians exploiting a sense of fear, because people look to someone to give them simple answers for complicated situations. And that's what we're seeing. Rupert Lowe has written to the Prime Minister about closing our borders and all of his usual preoccupations on the basis of this Huntingdon attack. We don't know anything about the motive or about the suspect in person. So I think, it is a bit of a dangerous path. So it's important to provide that context when we can.
I think that's the motive is the sort of the animating question for me, its presence or lack thereof. And as you're absolutely right to flag, Anoosh, at present, there is just a suspect. No one has been found guilty or not guilty, and there are live criminal proceedings. So there is a limit to what we can actually say about this instance.
Yeah.
But last week, there was a conclusion was reached in a trial of a man who was stabbed to death queuing in a Lloyd's entirely randomly. And I think there's one word that sort of summarizes the paranoia, and it's why. Why did this happen? And if, as was the case with the Plymouth shootings, you could say that individual was motivated by an incel type ideology, as was the case of that recent horrific crossbow attack. Again, in the case, it would appear that, motivated by misogyny, that there's actually, you can kind of take comfort in being able to attribute far right, misogynistic, an Islamist, you go, well, at least I can kind of put an ideology on this. But if it's random, there is a sort of, it instills a type of terror that perhaps those other types of attack don't necessarily.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we need a story when these things happen. We need a story to tell ourselves. We need a narrative. Yeah. And if it fits into a category, then it is just easier to control it in your mind. There's
all your own prejudices.
Yeah, or your own prejudices, that it matches your own prejudices. Or if it doesn't, then you dismiss it and think it's less bad than the last thing that happened that did match your prejudices. We're only human. We all do it. So I think you're right. There's a comfort in that. And I remember interviewing the former government's counter-extremism czar, who was grappling with this issue. He was saying basically there's two categories that he dealt with in his office: Islamist extremism, far-right extremism. But there were all of these other things in the middle, this grab bag of actually not very political stuff, 15-minute cities, just sort of strange conspiracy-based obsessions that some people had that may have resulted in violence, but it just wasn't the type of thing that we would be picked up by Prevent, for example, wasn't the type of thing that would come under the definition of terrorism. And so it sort of fell into this no man's land. And I think that is a really big issue, particularly when you've got some of these cases which are a bit of a grey area. Someone's very mentally unwell, but they were looking up certain things online and obsessing about them beforehand.
Yeah, I think the issue of online radicalisation, which is separate from how we treat terrorism, which has to have a clear ideology and political purpose. Online radicalisation is much vaguer, much more broad, encompasses people who are slightly dissatisfied and alienated, who can then go down an algorithmic rabbit hole that doesn't necessarily have a clear set of political objectives, but involves being fed a whole lot of content, like you were discussing earlier, that is really, as well as being horrific to look at, is also quite damaging to carry on looking at. And if you feed all of that together with somebody who is themselves a little bit chaotic or has a lifestyle where they don't get the necessary support, you end up in a space where it's not terrorism, it's not mental illness on its own, it's not just the algorithm making them do it. It is the combination of a whole load of toxic factors where there's no single part of the state that is set up to deal with it.
Shiraz Marr has written very interestingly about this. It's on the New Statesman website. We splashed on it yesterday. It's a little bit technical, but it is fascinating that sort of making the case that essentially the Prevent categorizations now are perhaps a little bit outdated, that whereby if you cannot identify a clear ideology and attribute it to a perpetrator of an attack, that we essentially don't have the kind of the categorization, the apparatus, the infrastructure to be able to identify someone like an Axel Rudakabana who repeatedly expresses an interest in committing violence, but because we can't say, oh, well, he's an Islamist, or we can't say, oh, he's a misogynist. It's then actually very difficult for the kind of the de-radicalization counter-terror mechanism that we have to actually kick into gear and do something about it. We don't yet know whether the attacker was suffering from any particular mental health condition, although I would probably just raise the challenge that anyone who conducts an act of mass violence, there's clearly some sort of mental health issue going on there for you to be able to sort of perpetrate that sort of thing. But let's just, like we said previously, live criminal investigation. We're not going to talk too much about the specifics of that case. But the Nottingham attacker, Valdo Calicain, was a paranoid schizophrenic. Southport killer Axel Rudakabana, who we spoke about previously, was also under the care of an NHS mental health service. Is it sort of, am I overreaching by trying to draw a connection between perhaps the crumbling nature of social care, mental health service provision in Britain? I know, Rachel, you made the point in the first half about broken Britain and how it connects to this story. I
think front lines of the state, they're connected, right? And when you get crumbling in one, it's connected to the other. So we've talked a lot about on this podcast over the years about how cuts in council budgets, for example, those show up in hospital admissions, and the crisis in social care shows up in a lack of beds. And similarly, if you look at things like cuts to funding of youth services, social services for teenagers. If you cut early intervention initiatives, they show up down the line in much more violent and tragic and extreme circumstances. The mental health and crime connection is something that you've got to factor in. You've got to factor it in, I think, to the criminal justice system as a whole. So again, not talking about the specifics of this case where we don't have any of the details, but I was struck by an example in a book by Chris Atkins that's all about people who get out of prison and what happens to them then, and reoffending rates, and how our entire probation service network system is so broken that people just end up back where they started. And there's a whole chapter there on healthcare and mental health in particular, and people who are treated for mental health conditions while in prison, then are released, are on probation, and are unable to access the services that they got in prison, the medication they got in prison, and therefore either end up committing crimes because they don't have the help and support that they need, or in one example ends up deliberately committing a crime in order to go back to prison, in order to get his medication, because that's the only way he can access it. So probation is one of the, I guess, the sort of Cinderella service of the criminal justice system as a whole. But it's one of those areas where you cut something that looks relatively cheap, mental health and addiction support for ex-offenders, and it comes back 1,000-fold in offending rates and the prison population. And you've got to see the interconnected element of all those different services.
Yeah, I remember doing a piece about child social care and how sort of ragged it is. And one of the things that came up with all the professionals that I was speaking to, and I don't know if Valdo Calacain and Axel Rudakabana were under CAMS, which is the Children's Mental Health Service, or under social care, child social care services. But what all of the professionals told me was basically someone has to reach crisis point to get any meaningful care. So like parents would be desperate for their children to get the right type of mental health support or general support. And those kind of early interventions that Rachel was talking about are no longer there because they're the bits that get cut. And so we sort of have a crisis service rather than a care service, which means that when people reach a crisis point, they often haven't been reached properly earlier. And so you do occasionally get these tragic events that are a manifestation of, someone's poor mental health. Although, again, people know right from wrong. And I think we can sometimes overdo it on the mental health narrative sometimes. These crimes are horrific. There's a lot of people suffering from mental health in this country. And, I think you have to be careful sometimes.
Yeah. Absolutely, you do. I obviously, I would hope that we could be charitable enough to draw a distinction between someone who might have anxiety versus possibly someone with psychosis or a schizophrenic.
And I think in the vast majority of those cases, when they hit crisis point, the person who ends up harmed the most is the individual themselves. That is far more likely than them going out to harm others. But it is also the case that a crisis has to be reached before they receive the help that they need. It's
so revealing though, Rachel. Like when you were saying it, mental health and addiction services, I was already thinking, like, you can just see the Daily Mail leader. You can see the Tory MP being like, so we're giving mental health support to ex-offenders. What do they need mental health support with? And it's actually, because we have this perception now, because actually quite a lot of good work has been done on destigmatizing mental health and the normalization of it, that actually a huge number of people suffer from it. I have it as well. When conversation arises, I sort of, something I will often say is I think we're too quick to come up with a pharmaceutical response to a mental health issue, because 9 times out of 10, often what you're talking about, the way you encounter it in your life, is someone who might have anxiety or might be depressed. But within that spectrum, there are paranoid schizophrenics. There are people with really serious bipolar disorder. And I wonder actually if even our own sort of the taxonomy of our own vocabulary for talking about this isn't quite up to the task of drawing a distinction between those various camps. There's a development in this story that probably does connect actually to state failure, possibly. The stabbing of a 14-year-old boy and 2 reports of a knifeman seen at a barber's in Peterborough are being investigated as part of the police inquiry into this. I'll just provide the details on that. The first incident of a man with a knife at a barber's in Fletton happened at 7:25 p.m. on Friday, but was reported to police at 9:10, so about 2 hours later. Police say at the time of reporting, the man was no longer there and had not returned, so we did not send officers, but a crime was raised. The second incident was reported to us at 9:25 a.m. on Saturday, again by the barber's Barbers in Fletton while the man was still at the scene. Officers were deployed to the location and arrived within 18 minutes. Upon searching the area, officers were unable to locate the man or identify him, and a crime was raised. So if it does, and it's a big if, but if it does transpire that possibly the person who perpetrated the attack on the train was also walking around Peterborough the day before with a large knife, it raises quite obvious and quite damning questions about the police response.
It does, and we don't know whether that's the case. But if it is, then the narrative does change quite a bit, because so far we've been reading reports of how fast the emergency services managed to reach the train, which, in itself reached Huntingdon really fast because of quick thinking on the train. It seems, so far that everyone did what they should have done in a horrible situation. But if this suspect or the same suspect was walking around with a knife the night before, and these incidents were reported, then why on earth were they allowed to board a train the next evening?
I don't know. I think if it was happening at 7:25 and it wasn't reported until 9:10, there's an argument that there's very little that the police could have done in that time to, if they were no longer there.
Again, the next morning though.
I
appreciate what you're saying. It's true.
I'm imagining how many phone calls police get and the triaging and prioritization they have to do, and whether looking for someone who they know is no longer going to be there when they don't have an accurate description versus the other things they could potentially have been dealing with. I would hate to have been the police officer who made that call, I should say.
It's really interesting you say that, Rachel. As Anoosh was speaking then, I was going to agree with you completely. and then I think, if you apply that lens, it's like, okay, so what's my perspective? My perspective is, if someone calls the police and says there was a man here 2 hours ago with a large knife, I expect the police to turn up, right? Yeah. But actually, on a Friday night, do the police have the officers working a shift that day? You're absolutely right. Someone's triaging going, I don't think we're going there. I think we're going here instead. There's a fight happening right now on the high street. That's where we're headed to. And that actually, if we were to look at the whole story, okay, confirmed there is a mass stabbing happening on a train right now as we speak. Okay, within 8 minutes, they're there. There is again this story probably about resourcing, about funding, about, in an ideal world, you'd have enough officers to be able to turn up in 8 minutes to whatever crime gets reported. But that's not the world we live in, is it?
Yeah, I just think because it's an alleged stabbing of a 14-year-old, a child, in a triaging process for no matter how stretched a police service would be, you'd assume that would be one of the first things that they would get to. But we don't know enough about what's gone on now, and we might come to it in a future podcast. But you're right, there are police services that are very stretched, and as I was writing in my column, not equipped to deal with the rising problem of knife crime in areas that haven't had that culture before. Yeah. And so that is apparently something that police forces have been grappling with, that don't have the kind of muscle memory of the Met, for example.
Maybe a final point for us to talk about, but I just wonder about these attacks, these mass atrocities. They feel, they almost feel quite American to me. To be honest with you, I don't view Britain as the country of the school shooting. I don't view Britain as the place of American, take the American, but American carnage. This sense of sort of constant and pervasive and surrounding violence, right? And I wonder if that's misplaced. I wonder if that's changing. And we were talking about it in our editorial meeting earlier this morning. Someone mentioned, actually, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. You had the IRA bombing campaigns, and actually there was a sense of violence being around the corner. But I do think it's different. And I, to use the terrorism example, I think terrorism has become increasingly nihilistic, right? I think whereas before, when we talk about the IRA specifically, it's the calculated use of horrific violence, but for political ends, right? So it's the intention, hopefully, presumably being, a negotiated settlement that leads to a united Ireland. And therefore, you understand that if the level of violence that you perpetrate is so extreme and pushes your opponents to such a level that they will no longer negotiate with you, right? It's all bets are off. We're now just completely at war with each other. We will not engage in dialogue with you. So you could look at, for example, things like the Harrods bombing, where the bomb is put outside Harrods and a few people die, as opposed to if it was inside the building, hundreds of people would die. That's a very specific and strategic decision, right? That's not to excuse any of the things that the IRA did. And I feel like the changing nature of terrorism, which has become more nihilistic, right? Whether it's, flying jetliners into skyscrapers and killing thousands of people, any of the horror and the atrocity perpetrated by ISIS, the increasing total nature of the violence that has shifted in sort of terror attacks in that way. And this might be just a complete reach, but I wonder if that nihilism is sort of bleeding over into other mass casualty type events, that even though we might say, well, actually this person has no discernible political ideology, but that doesn't, they're still perfectly aware of the increasingly ultra-violent nature of some of the other attacks that take place, and whether or not that's informing these things that are happening now. I mean, I'm just sort of going out there. I don't know what you guys make of that point about whether sort of nihilism is more present in the way that these things take place, or I'm just sort of going a little bit too far.
Yeah, I think there is a difference conceptually, obviously not a difference to the victims and the families of the victims, but between a terrorist act that has a clear political aim, something that the perpetrators are trying to achieve, and somebody who is so damaged or so radicalized by whatever it is that has damaged and radicalized them that they have an attitude of let the world burn, cause as much carnage as possible. The point is not political change. The point is the pain and tragedy and making everyone else feel as much pain as that individual is in. I think those are quite different conceptually. And one of them, countering terrorism is incredibly challenging and difficult. And as the threat of terror has changed and evolved, security services have struggled to catch up. But one of them, at least, you can have some kind of strategy against, because ultimately you're arguing with people who are in some ways rational, and what it is they want. You're operating in the same reality, and one of them you're operating in a completely different reality. And it's very difficult to think about how you counter that or build a framework to make people safer in that context.
Yeah, I think when people don't have hope, then that's a very dangerous scenario. So I've been thinking about nihilism in a different context, Ollie, so I was glad you mentioned it in our editorial meeting this morning, because I do think it's dangerous for politicians and certain political parties to talk about sort of Britain as this sort of falling society, somewhere which is socially breaking down and civil war is around the corner, because that is a very nihilistic view of the world. And it's dangerous on two levels. First of all, on the level that we've been talking about, take away someone's hope who's already quite unstable and who knows what they're going to do. But secondly, it's politically quite stupid, because when you feel hopeless about the world and nihilistic, then you don't vote. You don't believe anyone's going to help you. And so I think Nigel Farage, particularly with reform, should be careful not to give too much of a nihilistic view of British society, because I've already been to places that are being run by reform councils where I've spoken to people who are reform-minded in all of their views, who are like, oh no, I don't vote. I won't vote for them. No, they're all the same. Already, in areas where they can see that the world around them isn't changing, and they're also hearing from those same politicians that the world is getting worse. So I think I think this new nihilism is actually something that we should look at quite closely, because I think you've struck on something there.